show up to church because God always has a word. Amen. Revelation 2:8 brings us to the church of Smyrna. It's kind of a funny name, huh? It's almost like they messed up. Smyrna. No, it's not a child's name. It's a real name from the ancient world. And in verses 8 through 11, it says, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, right, these things says the first and the last who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. But be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, do you guys have ears? Let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Going back to the first verse we looked at there, he says it again to the angel. We know already from last week's message that angel can mean messenger. And there is probably most likely a messenger to the church, an elder, a pastor of the church in Smyrna. Smyrna is a place in ancient Turkey. Now we call it the city of Izmir. So that's if you look at the Mediterranean Sea, right, it's kind of like this, like a half circle, right? And right here is Jerusalem, and right here is Turkey, and right here is Egypt. And so they kind of do this number with their boats and everything. They travel the world, and that port of Smyrna is a very important port where boats would land and trade would happen. It was the entrance to all of the north of Turkey and even up into Russia. So it's a very important place. It was really rich. It was a rich place because of that. A lot of people ended up there. There was a lot of religion. There was a lot of Jews there. They ended up there. There was a lot of the church there. And there was a lot of money and idolatry. So it's the same thing we see in Ephesus. And it claimed to be just as great a city as Ephesus, not better. And yet they had some serious problems going on for the church. So he goes to the angel of the church. So here's another thing you're going to learn. The word church, it means in Greek, ekklesia. Ecclesiastes, right? Ecclesia. The called out ones. That's me and you. Those who have believed in Jesus Christ, who've been called out of the kingdom of darkness and into the kingdom of light. We've been called out of the world and into God's kingdom, right? There's two different worlds. And we're coming out of the old world and learning to live in the new world, the new life. How many of you guys can say, I have a new life in Christ? The old has passed away, and behold, everything is new. Amen. If any man or woman is in Christ, they're a new creation. All things have passed away. They're the ecclesia, the ones who've been called out of that. You're no longer dead. You're alive. Amen? Amen. We don't have to stay dead. We don't have to stay in our old ways, but it's not easy to learn the new ways either, especially if you're doing it in the flesh, right? And God, He's constantly calling us to live a life in the Spirit, to live in the Spirit. The flesh profits nothing, right? So when Jesus starts opening it up, he says, these things says the first and the last who was dead and came to life. So here's another thing about Smyrna, ancient Smyrna. Back in the day, Alexander, or before Alexander the Great conquered the world, and it was, the Greeks who conquered the whole world before Rome. Smyrna was competing against different cities, and the people who would conquer that city, they would conquer cities and level them. So that way their citizens couldn't compete with their other cities, the ones that they wanted to prosper. So they would level cities, they would decimate everybody, move everybody out, and make it come to nothing. They would just basically steamroll your home. and make you become, poor and have to move. And it was a humiliating thing. Well, that happened to Smyrna, and it was dead, right? And because of its importance, though, later on, Alexander the Great, and then even Rome, through the Roman road system, the city of Smyrna resurrected back to life because it had an important part to play in the plan of God, for sure, but even in the economy of the world. So when Jesus says to the church of Smyrna, he who was dead and came to life, there's a lot of this kind of way of thinking in the city. Our city was once dead and now we're alive. And Jesus was once dead and now he's alive, right? So he draws those parallels there. He makes us see that I'm the same person who can bring someone who's dead back to life. And also something that's important to understand about Smyrna is that the name Smyrna comes from the name myrrh. Smyrna, right? Have you heard of myrrh in the Bible? That's like one of the things. If you were to look up myrrh in the Bible, it would come up many, many times. It was a scent, right? A perfume that they would make out of myrrh. They would crush it up and make it into dust and turn it into perfume. But they used it in the burial rituals, especially the Egyptians. The Egyptians bought tons of it. The pharaohs and all of them, they bought tons and tons of myrrh. And when Jesus was born, right? When Jesus was born, he was presented with myrrh, right? And myrrh is something usually given at death or some sort of ceremony, but usually death. And it was a chief export of Smyrna. So they understood that they were kind of like the funeral home people where you buy your funeral home supplies from. And that was one of the things necessary for embalming. See, they would fill, and the Egyptians especially learned how to use myrrh to embalm people so that way they could save their bodies for the afterlife. And that was why they began to become really rich, because they exported a lot of this. And Smyrna had earned a special right in the Roman world to become the only provider of this for the whole world. It was like they're the only provider of the internet. Except for it wasn't the internet, it was myrrh. And so maybe the wise men, when they came and brought myrrh to Jesus when he was born, maybe they passed through Smyrna and they brought myrrh with them, because they were the ones who had the right to distribute the myrrh. And then when Jesus died, right, he was wrapped in cloth and anointed with myrrh, probably from Smyrna. Death, right? Jesus said, I was the one who was dead and now is alive. And really, he's trying to get a message across to those people who are in Smyrna. So the people in Smyrna, they were going through some really hard times. They were being faced with death because of their faith. Okay? They were being faced with annihilation. They were being faced with losing everything. And Jesus wanted them to know they serve a victorious, risen Christ. Amen? Are you with me here? Do you know you serve a victorious, risen Christ? No matter what you go through, Jesus is victorious. Nobody can take that away. It's already happened. He defeated death. He conquered death. And he's just reminding them, I was the one who was dead and is alive, and you served me. So no matter what you face, nobody can do anything greater than defeat death. That's who we serve. And so I really think the myrrh thing is pretty cool. Smyrna, right? Myrrh has us something to teach us, right? I think when the wise men brought the myrrh, Jesus was prepared to die from the moment he came. Jesus came to die for our sins, and they brought him everything he would need to accomplish what he came for in life. And then in verse 9, he says, I know your works. That's something he says to all of the churches, the 7 churches of Revelation. I know your works. He knows the suffering of his people. Jesus knows what it's like to suffer. He suffered himself. He was tempted in every way me and you were. The only difference is he didn't fail. He didn't fall into temptation. But he knows our works. He knows the works of Smyrna, the people there. He knows the works of you here. And he knows the tribulation. We're going to talk about what tribulation means. He knows their poverty, but he puts in parentheses there, right? Jesus puts, but you are rich. I like how he throws that in there. I know your poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So we're going to explain all of that. And I just want to bring up that. What is a synagogue of Satan? How can there be a synagogue of Satan? So in those days where the believers lived in Smyrna, there was a persecution happening in the city against the Christians there. The Christians had become prominent, but then this persecution started happening because, they crucified Jesus, right? And the Jews rejected him, religious Jews of the time. And so this was happening in Smyrna as well. And the people who should have seen the truth, they were bringing the worst pain to the people of God. It was a spirit of religion that was taking over, and it was keeping them bound. That's what religion does, is it keeps us blinded. And they say that they are Jews, but they're really working for Satan. That's what religion can do. You could say you believe something, but you're really hindering the work of God. But in a sense, they're actually not serving God, but they're serving his purposes, because the church of Smyrna was coming closer to Christ. You know what those people, the synagogue of Satan, reminds me of? Paul the Apostle. Saul of Tarsus was his name before, right? Saul of Tarsus was a religious Jew. And he was there watching when the first martyr was martyred. And he was just there watching and holding their coats and making sure everybody was well taken care of and they could throw a rock and kill Stephen. Right? And then later on, he got even more zealous, and he wanted to go around rounding up Christians and yanking them out of their home and terrifying them in front of their children. And look at what your mom and dad are going to do. They believe in Jesus, they're going to go to jail. And they got them and humiliated them in front of their family and threw them in jail. And this was Paul the Apostle before he was Paul the Apostle. He had the spirit of a religion as well. And he was stuck in that. It was ingrained into him. And then, if you look at that picture over there that we have on the wall, something happened on the road to Damascus. Right? You guys know what that is, right? That's Paul in his Roman gear, because Paul was a Roman citizen, by the way, and he's just getting knocked off his horse and blinded. Now, that's what God will do to you. When you're bound in the spirit of religion and he wants to get a hold of you, he'll just knock you off your high horse. And you'll end up flat on your back, blinded, and saying, God, help me, please. The synagogue of Satan perhaps later on became those people like Paul. They were bringing real pain on the believers. But the believers in Smyrna were a suffering people, just like the suffering Messiah, right? Jesus was a suffering Messiah. He didn't come and the Jews largely rejected him because he didn't take over the government. They thought when the Messiah comes, he's going to restore order to the whole world. But that's really not what Jesus came to do the first time. The first time he came to die and pay the price for sinners like me and you. He came to live a sinless life. He did exactly what he came out to do, but he was a suffering Messiah. And they just could not see that. They couldn't see how the Messiah, the promised one, could die. How could God, if he's God, right? That's how they even mocked him on the cross. The thief on the cross, one of them, both of them mocked him, and they said, I thought you were the Son of God. Why don't you just get yourself off the cross? Right? There's all sorts of humiliation Jesus was suffering, they were pulling his beard out. They were punching him. They put crown of thorns and beat him on the head. They slapped him around and they mocked him many times. Have you ever been in that place of being mocked? And it's just angry, right? It makes you get angry, and it makes you feel like helpless and just filled with despair. And Jesus could have called down 10,000 angels to his side at any time, but he had to do this, and he held it together, and he was able to suffer as one who was mocked. In that day, when the Christians were being persecuted in Smyrna, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but all they had to do really was get a pinch of incense and say, "Caesar is Lord," and it would end. Right? All they had to do is bow their knee to Caesar. I find that so interesting, how the enemy puts pressure on us in different ways. Sometimes today all you have to do is just not say anything about Jesus, and the devil will leave you alone. That's why some people give up, because I just want this to stop, right? Because sometimes we haven't fully counted the cost. And so the Christians who counted the cost, they're not going to bow their knee no matter what. And so the Christians in that day would get a little pinch of incense, and they'd say, "Caesar is Lord," and they'd get a certificate and just walk away, and they could become Roman citizens. Christians would not do that, because Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. All right? They would not give no man the name of Lord. They would keep Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. And it was a very important thing. And it still is a very important thing. They wouldn't conform to the world. And they had to, because they saw what happens if you bow the knee. You get sucked right back into the world. It's compromise. That's how the enemy works, is just little compromises. And he was working on the people of Smyrna, and he was bringing tribulation. That's another word. He says, "I know your tribulation." Right? Tribulation. That word tribulation, in the ancient times, it was an ancient method of torture. The tribulation would be, they would lay a man on his back, and then they would get heavy stones, stack them on his chest until he either recanted, or the weight got so heavy that he couldn't breathe finally, and he just stopped breathing and it crushed him. Right? And Jesus is saying, "I know the torture, I know the tribulation that you're going through, I know the weight that is on your chest, I know the stacks and stacks of weight that is being placed upon you." One of the words, other interesting words, is patience. In the Greek is hupotasso, being able to bear up under weight. Jesus says, "I will give you the ability to bear up under weight. When weight comes upon you, I'll help you carry it." And so it was that the church was facing these weights, and there's three of them. Three different weights, three different stones. Poverty, right? They were facing poverty. They were facing slander. Okay, this is another form of persecution. These are forms of persecution. So, and then there was imprisonment and death. Three different stones. The first one we'll talk about is poverty. "I know your tribulation, your poverty." It says, in those days, a Christian, to be out in the open, would be marginalized. If they worked for somebody who didn't like that they didn't bow their knees to the gods, then they would fire them. And then they didn't have any way to pay. And it's not like they had like, what are the Monster.com and Indeed and Facebook and places like that to find work. Like if you didn't have work, it was just like, and you couldn't go find work in the trades, because the trades were all centered around building things for the gods. So they wouldn't get involved in that. And even if they did, they would probably kick you out because it was a religious thing. Most of the trades were all centered around worship of the gods, especially in Smyrna. And at that time, Smyrna was really leaning towards worship of the emperor of Rome himself. That's where they were. And they built this huge temple to Zeus. Okay, and all the trade that was happening was because of Zeus. That's what they said, So everything, like anytime they made money, they'd pay temple taxes and tithes to the gods and stuff like that. And of course, the Christian wouldn't do that. So they ended up getting fired or not being hired, or if they had anything that they could maybe go out and collect and sell, nobody would buy it from them. They would just kind of and they ended up so bad of a spot that they became really poor. And Jesus actually, he says that, I know your poverty. I know that you've lost everything from me. I know that what you have been going through because the enemy, right, in the world just doesn't care. Don't expect pity from the world, right? But God has a way of showing up and giving us mercy. The world, not from the world, but in the world, will show us mercy. It's always from the Lord. And so this poverty, I wonder why he says, but you are rich, in the parentheses there. Because they were like, oh man, we're poor. It's hard to feed our kids. It's hard to feed myself. It's hard to find work. And those times, like I think about in the Great Depression, I heard stories like from my grandfather, the Great Depression, other times of recession, things like that, where it was really hard. And people who lived through the Great Depression, they learned to save everything, and they learned to live off of just the very minimal means. And that's where you got the greatest generation arose from, because those types of times created unity. And people have to learn to depend on each other, and they work together, and they took care of each other. Maybe in those times when you are feeling like this, God is doing the work, and He's really simplifying and purifying your life and giving you a lesson and a blessing. There's a parable of the rich fool. So the rich fool, he had everything. He had everything that you could ask for, right? And many people don't get this parable. Part of the reason is because some people might possibly get caught up in this. I think in America we could get caught up in this often. The parable of the rich fool is in Luke chapter 12, if you want to turn there. Luke chapter 12, verse 13, starts off with a story. One from the crowd, Jesus is walking, there's a crowd. Somebody from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." So Jesus made it real clear. Your life isn't about, who you are isn't defined by what you own. It's defined by who owns you. And then he spoke a parable. Parables, they had rich meaning. The parables were not clear, but yet they were so clear. And people had to dig to find the nuggets of truth in there. Find that I take care of things that I work for, don't you? So the parable, he spoke to them, saying, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, So you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. You know, the church of Smyrna was able to see the other side of that, right? They did not lose their witness, and they were probably under incredible persecution. But the rich man in this parable, you notice how he was speaking to himself and how he said, what shall I do? And he was actually praising himself, and he was all centered on me. He was just saying I all the time. He had what some preachers call an I problem, right? That I problem is the stuff that gets us in trouble. And you could gain all kinds of things by saying I. You really could. You could stack up loads of money. You still wouldn't be happy. Still wouldn't be satisfied. And at the end, God would say, fool, you're not going to be able to keep those things. That's what happens when you stack up riches. Somebody else takes them in the future. Riches are just temporary. What's eternal, that's what matters. And that's probably what meant more to the people of Smyrna than anything, is they had an eternal mind. Their things and their thoughts were centered on the eternal. And they wouldn't bow their knee to the world, and they wouldn't give up their witness, and they weren't concerned about worldly things like this rich man was, because they knew they couldn't take it with them. What they could take with them, and why Jesus is writing about them, and why we're learning about them in history, is because they didn't lose their witness. That's the most important thing that you can have besides your salvation, is your witness as a Christian. Yes, salvation first, because obviously we need to be saved, and then we want others to be saved. What makes us credible? You know what makes people credible is when they really show what they believe. Because if you just say things but your actions don't line up, then you don't really believe those things, do you? Right? What you say you believe, and then how you follow up on that's what really means something. So your actions will betray your words, or they'll really prove your words, right? The people of Smyrna guaranteed were true believers, because Jesus says they're ready to go to death. They're ready to die for what they believe in. That's how committed they were. They're in poverty. Lose my job, I'll lose my life. In America, we're very blessed, right? We've been able to come into many abundance of things. I look at our thrift store, and I think people are getting rid of this. They're just giving it to us. And I'm blown away all the time, because in other countries that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen like that, guys. There's not thrift stores like that in other countries. Here there is. There's an abundance of things. And we get to turn those things into heavenly profit, right? We transform those things into many different avenues. And yet there's something behind that too. There's something behind that. Maybe the affluence people have. I mean, most of the people are generous, and we thank them, you know. There's very many good people. But they know we'd rather give this to the Lord's work. That's why it ends up at our place. I think of all the different things that end up at places that don't have nothing to do with God. Or people who end up at places that don't have nothing to do with God. You can go to rehab, you can go to church, but to be honest with you, those places can't heal you like the Lord can. And some places, even some churches are all about money, right? You see them asking for money all the time. The church of Smyrna wouldn't ask you for money. They would probably ask you if you knew the Lord. They'd probably ask you if they can give you the last meal that they had, and if they could give you the shirt off their back too. They would probably protect you if somebody was beating you up. They'd probably stand in the way and take the beating themselves. That's what I see in these people here. They would probably let themselves get hurt instead of you. Because they had this heart that was just genuine. The second stone that was slander. They were facing slander. So it's one thing to suffer for what you believe in, but one of the ways that they were bringing persecution was slander too. So the synagogue of Satan, the Jews who don't believe or who are not followers of Christ, they were saying bad things about the Christians because they didn't participate in their way or the world's way. They're getting marginalized because they were set apart. They were holy. And so the stories, though, were taking place. Rumors, how a rumor mill can get started. A rumor mill can get started here right now. And if that is happening, we got to put those rumors and gossip, anything like that brings in a spirit of rebellion. We have to not do that. We have to not talk behind each other's back because it's slanderous. And we slander each other's character, and the devil loves it. If that's happening, you need to put a stop to it, right? And this is what we see here. There were stories being told, and things being thought of. The devil is able to put thoughts into people's minds. Well, they're talking about like, hey, these Christians, so-called Christians, they go to this meeting on Sunday morning, and when they do, it's just a huge sexual orgy. And that's not why the believers are going there, right? But how embarrassing for them to say that, as they're going to just worship the Lord, and then they're making some sort of accusation like that, or they're going and they're making people do weird stuff, or they're all these different things. The devil has a way of twisting people and getting people to feel ashamed. That's really what slander is all about, is feeling ashamed. And what's crazy about slander is that even the people who share in slander, they feel ashamed too. And so the arguments that are going on in the church of Smyrna and why they're being marginalized, and they're like, hey, those people are weird. Did you hear the things that they're doing? That was one way that the enemy was marginalizing, was making them not credible. And it was a lie, though. It was a complete lie. The devil's so good about that, guys. He's able to create lies like that don't exist. He'll take leaders out like that. He'll take people out like that because he'll want to make you feel ashamed. Very powerful. Very powerful, the slander is. And so they were being pushed to the side more and more until it was painful. And their kids were suffering too. That's probably the most painful part. And so I saw this happening in America this year with the COVID and all the things that were happening. Believers were being marginalized in our society too. And a lot of it started off because of the restrictions and stuff like that. And so of course everybody wants to play ball. And we're all cooperating and stuff. And then, of course, people have different ideas. And when you broad brush a whole society with just one, like, everybody's doing this and everybody's doing that, but you leave people get lost in the broad brush, right? People get lost in that, and so a lot of people are falling through the cracks. And some churches and different people began to see the harm that was coming from that. So they decided for their own communities that they had to take certain actions. And so they did that. You guys know, like, stuff like suicide was up 300 or 400%. I don't know how many calls I got this past year with people whose family member had committed suicide. A lot. I can tell you that. A lot. Overdose, drug overdoses. People who were coming here, right? Because they wanted to get their life. I'm talking like 10, maybe 15 that I know of for sure. And if not more, that overdosed and died. That happened this last year. So, there was a big challenge because they're saying, hey, we can't. I mean, for us, we're fully allowed to remain open and keep doing what we're doing because we fall under a necessary category. What do they call it? Essential. There you go. Essential. So all the stuff that we do is essential. Even the thrift store. But the pressure that was coming because we're Christian, there was pressure. There was pressure there, having to endure. And so we have that challenge, but it was not so hard for me because we're going to keep going no matter what, because people's lives are on the line. People are dying from drugs and alcohol every day. They're not, and it's not that they might die, it's that they will die if they don't get help. That's a fact. I know that because I've been doing this for 15 years and I've seen hundreds, if not thousands of people die. So I take it very seriously. And there's other communities of believers and churches like that, and the world is not so kind to them. And then there's other pastors and people that I know of, and they're fighting with each other, right? And they're slandering each other, like, oh, our church is this and our church that. I'm like, don't quit being foolish. Don't be foolish. Don't give the world something to hang on to that can slander the name of Christ. Because for me, that's what it's about. Let's not give the world, they're already going to slander the name of Christ, because when somebody hits their foot or their nail, they don't say Buddha or Muhammad, they say Jesus Christ, right? People already slander the name of Jesus without even, why is that? And then if we give a bad witness, how much more are we giving them? Right? So this is damaging. It's damaging to the church, damaging to the work that God does, but God will not be hindered, right? I see multiple churches doing this. The enemy is rejoicing at this, and the division was happening because slander was one thing that was happening to the people of Smyrna. Let's not make a reason. 1 Peter 3:17 says, it's better if it is the will of God to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. You guys, we used to suffer for doing evil. The cops would be chasing you like, oh man, why do the cops always give me a hard time? Guess what, buddy? Because you were doing evil. He's just doing his job, making it hard for you to do evil. That's his job. You can't get mad at him for doing his job. You can't get even mad at Satan for doing his job, but I am mad at him anyway. But he's doing what he's supposed to do. But are you doing what you're supposed to do? It's better to suffer for doing good, because we used to suffer willingly, pay the price for doing bad, right? I'll just pay the price later, right? Was that your mindset? I'll just do this now, and who cares what happens later? Now, our minds are open, and we're thinking critically about the things of God and the work of God in your life. Do you want God to continue working in your life? Of course we do. But let's not give the world a reason to think that that's not true. Believers will be persecuted, right? So here's the last thing I want to talk about here. Imprisonment and death. Have any of you ever been faced with imprisonment or death for what you believe about Jesus? Anybody here? Kind of. It's rare. It's very rare here. I mean, there are times, especially I've heard even like in prison. I've heard of that happening. But Verse 10 says, do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. You know what I have a real problem with? I have a real problem with Christians who say we should always prosper and never go through bad times. And they even say that if you're not healthy, wealthy, and wise, that you're probably in sin. And this, what we're looking at right now, that's, then these people are in major sin, or Jesus is wrong. But they are going through some hard times, and he's saying, hey, you might have to die. How does that line up with that? Where's the prosperity in that? Right? What do we got to tell those people who are being persecuted for their faith today? What are we going to tell them? Like, hey, God bless, brother. No. Sometimes we do suffer for going through righteousness. Sometimes you are alienated from your family because you really want to suffer for the gospel, suffer for the kingdom's sake. You know that Jesus' way is better, and you may very well end up winning them because you didn't bow your knee. You have the high ground. It's like when Anakin and what's his name, were fighting on the Obi-Wan, I have the high ground, Anakin. Don't try to jump up to the world, I mean, the world ain't going to try to jump up to you. Anyway, bad analogy, but I just like Star Wars, so I thought I'd just throw that in there. Did I get an amen out there? All right. Amen. All right.
Yeah.
So, if you've ever faced anything, you would probably start thinking about it in the future, because things are changing, and the things that we see, the Bible describe that all ages of the church have suffered. Today we're suffering. Believers in different countries are suffering right now for what the very things me and you are doing in this room tonight. Really, right? They're suffering. I've been to a church service in Haiti, right? It's an open country, but it's a very demonic country. They have church 8 hours. They just can't get enough. 8 hours, I was like that. Splash water on me. It's because they know they need the Lord, because when they go back out, they're facing some real bad stuff. Believers in Matthew 10:22, Jesus said, you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. I'm going to take a guess, and probably nobody has actually been through that right there. But Jesus said it's a possibility. It's a possibility for me and you. Luke 21, and verse 12. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, so that way you can give a witness. Do you know the word martyr means witness? It doesn't mean to die, although that's commonly what happens. The word martyr means to give a witness. So if you just die for the sake of dying, well, that was just dumb. If you die to give a witness, right, to be brought before kings and rulers, because that's going to be how you get to share with them. There's people who are that committed to saying, you know what, if I can give my life to bring one person to Christ, tell you what, I will need a lot of grace on that in that time if that happens to me, but it's a possibility. Okay? But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. Welcome to church, guys. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls. Sounds real enticing, right? Only people who are crazy and who are committed. But you don't have to be both. You could just be committed. Or you could get committed, either one. But you guys don't know what that is, huh? All right. For any social justice warriors out there, okay, the issue of the persecuted church is one of the biggest human rights issues there is on the planet. I don't know if you guys know that. And it doesn't get great press on the news, okay? A couple of years ago, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, there was 42 schoolgirls who was abducted in Nigeria. And they were all taken, and almost none of them returned. Although I did hear that there was a schoolgirl from that abduction that just found her way back to her family. 4 years. Who knows what happened to them, but this happened because of the Muslim and Christian wars in Nigeria. I've told you guys a few times about the pastor that came from Nigeria that shared with us in our leadership conference in Mexico a few years ago. His name was Brother Bilay, right? And he spoke about all the different things that the church goes through, persecutions, abductions, killings. There was another story about the Nigerian pastor that was kidnapped by Boko Haram, right? And on the day of his execution, he had released a video, and he was pleading for Nigeria and the government to save him and his family members to pay his ransom. And in the video, a knife-wielding man stood behind the pastor as he begged. And the pastor was saying, anyone who has any intention should help and save me. Please release me from this pain. That was last month. He was let go. He actually got freed. He was able to tell the story. Amazing. But this is happening right now, all the time, guys. This is not something that happened just in the past. It didn't just happen to the church of Smyrna. See, I believe, like some people do, that these different churches exist in a sense today. That the persecuted church that we're talking about from those ages, the church of Ephesus, who lost their first love, exists today as well. Those are different sections of the church that we see out in our society today. I believe that the church of Smyrna has its presence as well today. And those are the persecuted people. And the top 5 countries in the world, guys, where it's hard and most difficult to follow Jesus: North Korea. Okay, that's the top. Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan. It goes on. There's 50 of them. You can go to opendoors.com, persecution.com. You can see those figures. It's really amazing. It's staggering. And then if there is something, if you are full of pride, go and visit those websites, and hopefully pride begins to exit your being as you read and hear the stories of people who have been given over to the witness of Jesus. That's what it does for me. I visit them often, even though it's hard, you know.
Are there mission trips?
Some of them. I don't think in a while there's been mission trips to Afghanistan or North Korea, although some of the chaplains and aid workers that are there, but they've been kidnapped too, so it's very dangerous. Libya, there certainly has been. There's Pakistan. Well, I have family that are, believe it or not, that are from Pakistan. I'm not Pakistani myself, but I have family who are, maybe I am Pakistani. I don't know, Dad. I mean, we don't know what's going on. But I have people, I have a friend who's married to my cousin, and he's a Christian, and he's a Pakistani, and He's like, invited me to go. I'm like, okay, I'll go. Did you see my eyes shift real quick? All right, I'll go. I probably would, though. But what kind of faith do you have to live out your faith in these countries? You could go to a mission trip and you could come back. But there's people who go there and they live there. And they stay there. Question, what kind of faith does it take to live it out? It takes just simple faith. The same faith that me and you had to trust Jesus as our Savior. To trust that he's going to provide. The same thing that it said there in Luke 21, that settle in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict. If you trust that Jesus' words are real there, he will show up. That's the kind of faith, though, you need. It's a real simple faith, and it's a deep faith, though. And you can have that. You know, how will you respond if you face persecution here? Like I said, it's probably a good guess that many of us haven't faced these things we've been talking about. Maybe you have. I can't discount that. I don't know what's happened to anybody, but it's not normal yet. I feel like it could be. I feel like it could become normal more and more. Or maybe our kids, or maybe it's just something radical happens. We have to think that way, and we have to be prepared that way. And you have to have your heart settled beforehand, like it says in Luke, how you're going to respond at work when people are doing things they're not supposed to, whether it's stealing. You can see a mark of a Christian is integrity and honesty. That will get you further than anything, but it will cost you in the short term. Okay? Honesty and integrity will cost you in the short term, but in the long term, it'll get you somewhere. Or it'll get you kicked out like Smyrna. It'll get you fired. But your witness will be intact. And Jesus, he'll write a great letter for you. Right? That's what he did for these guys. He gave them an endorsement here. You get an endorsement from Jesus. You did something right. So here's a test that I think that could be coming. Maybe it's not death. Like I said, it's possible, but I think the test will be whether or not me and you here tonight are going to bow our knee to Caesar, or we're going to bow our knee to the gods of our old life, drugs, alcohol. That's the test. Are we going to bow our knee? Hey, Jesus did a new work in your life. Oh man, but something went bad. Now I'm really tempted to go back. There's the test. Faith isn't faith until it's tested, right? And so when it comes to serving God, or losing your job, losing money, or your house, or influence, will we burn that incense? Will we get it and say Caesar is Lord? Right? Will you do that? Yeah. When it comes to temptation and something appears right in front of you that you're not supposed to have, will you get that incense and say Caesar is Lord? When somebody tells you you're weird for what you believe in Jesus, get that incense and say, you know what, it's no big deal. I don't really believe that. It could mean everything. By your patience, possess your souls. Okay? Because there's forks in the road that come along in life that don't seem like that big a deal until we look in the past and we realize, I should have taken a left turn at Albuquerque. Like Bugs Bunny, right? I should have did the right thing. I'm going to end with Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31. It says, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore, do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. It's not before you've done the will of God, it's after you've done the will of God. Okay? For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. And so, you're thinking about the church of Smyrna. Could it be that some of these things come into your life? I would challenge you to settle it in your hearts. I'm not going to bow. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to surrender. We've already done all those things. And God has used our foolishness to save us even. You're not going to be able to outsmart God anyway. And so, he who has an ear, show me your ears, guys. Anybody got an ear? He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. You might die once. Well, we're born twice already, right? That's what it said. What the preachers say. Born once, die twice. That's a person who's not saved. Or you can be born twice and die once. It's a person who is saved. Because after this is eternal life.